Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the ISCA panel on societal challenges. We had an amazing 50 years of microprocessor technologies that have advanced all aspects of our lives. So in this panel, we are going to discuss societal impacts and challenges brought by technologies and products that have empowered our social well-beings and where we see the field going for the next decades. So opinions that's going to be shared in this panel represent ourselves unless otherwise specified.
Great, so we have an amazing group of panelists here today. We have Carol from Facebook, and Bobby and I are both from Microsoft. Shane is from Harvard Business School, and Partha's from Google. And rather than having me tell you about all of them, we're going to have everyone do a brief intro and tell us a little bit more about one of the key topics of our panel. So to kick it all off, I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on where do you see computing going for the next 50 years and what societal challenges do we face with today's digital technologies? So Partha, do you want to start and give us your thoughts?
Sure. Thanks for having me at the panel. So my name is Partha Ranganathan. I work at Google, and I lead a bunch of efforts around systems infrastructure, everything from data centers to servers and the software surrounding all the Google services. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I think the topic of the panel was around the intersection of the advances of computing technology with potential societal challenges. And I thought the way I would look at it is these two big buckets. One is all the advances we have in computing come with some potential societal challenges. So what are the challenges created by computing advances? And then a second bucket, which is solving societal challenges using these various advances as well. So that's roughly the two buckets in which I want to structure my opening remarks on. So if I look at computing advances, Moore's law is a phenomenal thing. So for 50 years, we've continued to have amazing growth. Things have started tapering off a little bit, but it's a fantastic place to be in. And one of the things that we've been focused on is performance. But as Dennard scaling slows down and as we start getting more power hungry, an important thing to look at also is sustainability. And I think that to me is an interesting problem for us to be looking at. And again, in sustainability, there are two big components. One is the operating energy, which I think a lot of us spend a lot of time looking at, but there's also the embedded energy. And being able to think about sustainability as a first-class design consideration in how we design systems, I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities there. The second aspect of as we keep growing and as computing becomes the bedrock on top of which everything else rests, fundamental issues around privacy, security, fairness become super important. And I think, again, as computer architects, as system designers, we have a lot of interesting ways in which we can contribute. And so I think that's something that is super exciting as well. And then finally, I want to take a step back and think about, we have been all used to Moore's law. And Moore's law underpins everything from like the smallest IoT devices to phones to self-driving cars to cloud computing. And when you think about the slowing of Moore's law, it's sometimes easy to forget the implications on the global economy that slowing of Moore's law can have. And in some respects, I think it's a moral obligation for all of us here to figure out how do we have the next generation of Moore's law advances coming in when you have $1 trillion economy that rests on all the advances in Moore's law. So I think that's, even though it's not a problem we create, I think it's a problem we own. So I'd like to put that in that bucket as well. But while it's easy to think about all the problems around new societal challenges that our advances create, it's also important to realize the phenomenal impact that computing advances have had in solving a lot of societal challenges. And in particular, I think I look at all the benefits of machine learning to solve societal problems, whether it is around health, but also even around sustainability. If I look at some of the things around using machine learning for wind forecast or for data center cooling, or machine learning to look at uh, agricultural, industrial, right? So there's a whole bunch of things where machine learning can potentially transform society, and I think that's important. And it's worth noting, I love this quote from Lee Kuhn in Facebook, who points out that computing is the oxygen under which machine learning thrives. And so it's really important that all the advances that we do provide the fodder for us to be able to use machine learning in these interesting ways. Second, around sustainability, while I argued that we need to start thinking about sustainability as a first-class consideration in how we design systems, it's worth also remembering that the computing, the IT equipment is a very small fraction of the total sustainability footprint in the world right now. Big industries like transportation, agriculture, industrial emissions. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that lead to the carbon footprint that we think about. And again, technology can be brought to bear to solve those. And then I look at ISCA being run virtually. And just the last year when we've all avoided travel and we have tried to do stuff through video conferencing. And the impact that that particular technology has had on the broader footprint has been phenomenal. And I think there's a whole bunch of other opportunities for us to use computing to improve sustainability. And then finally, I think cloud computing is again, and I don't mean to just use buzzwords here, but it is a pretty fundamental inflection point in how we think about computing systems. And one thing that is very intriguing, and I hope we can discuss this later in the panel as well, is the potential of cloud to democratize access to new technology, and being able to have everybody from the smallest business to the biggest business have the latest advances in computing technology, the latest advances in machine learning, the latest advances in security, the latest advances in fairness. I think it's an underemphasized opportunity, and I wish we all could spend more time on that. So that in brief is my opening remarks. The takeaway really is the last 50 years has been fantastic, and I fully expect the next 50 years to be equally impactful, and there's a lot of opportunities ahead. So with that, thanks, Sarah. I'll pass it on to the next person.
That was great. There's a lot of interesting stuff there that I'm excited to talk about later in the panel. Up next, we have Bobby. I'd love to hear your thoughts on where we're going in the next 50 years and the societal challenges we face.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I think it's phenomenal. Really looking forward to hearing what everybody else's perspectives are. So my name is Srilata Mane, or Bobby Mane, as most people know me. I work at Microsoft. I'm a principal hardware engineer. And just to reiterate, the opinions stated here are mine and not those of my company. So talking about 50 years in the past and also looking forward. So 5 decades ago, there was perhaps one mini computer for hundreds to thousands of people. Now the average person in the US has greater than 10 connected devices in their household, and this is expected to be 3 times the world population by 2023. So Moore's law and Dennard scaling, as noted earlier, have facilitated the computing revolution. And as those benefits have petered out, we have relied on specialized devices, or such as GPUs or accelerators, to achieve our goals. Now, the devices, networks, data centers, and the silicon technology that enables them, they all have a sustainability impact on the planet. They require materials that are difficult to extract or have toxic effects on the environment, and they result in over 50 million metric tons of e-waste a year. But as Partha mentioned, there is another side to the story, which is that there are significant sustainability benefits resulting from this computing technology. Programs like FarmBeats at Microsoft address how to optimize operations on a farm using technology that is inexpensive and readily available to people in rural areas. Food production, as this chart shows, accounts for 19% of the world's carbon emissions, and producing food more efficiently and with less toxicity has long-term benefits for the planet. Another example is the current COVID outbreak. As horrendous as the outbreak has been and continues to be, technology has enabled a portion of the population and the economy to continue to operate working remotely. And in addition, the global carbon emissions because of this remote work has dropped in 2020 by about 6.5%, with a big portion of that resulting from reduction in vehicle usage and transportation in the US. So to answer the question of where I see technology going in the future, I'd argue we need a two-pronged approach. First, we need to do more with less. When it comes to silicon, we're already experiencing a shortage of components, and these trends will likely continue as resources become more scarce. We must be more resourceful in how we design silicon and devices so that we can achieve the same goals, but with fewer components and less power. So can we architect systems that require less silicon or make the components last longer by making them reliable, expandable for future requirements, and repairable so that we would have to be replaced less often. And second, we should consider how technology can reshape the world and make everyone's lives more sustainable. For instance, remote work has lowered carbon emissions and workers see personal benefits to working remotely, at least part of the time. Can we lean into this trend and create better technology to enable more people to work remotely or to work more effectively while remote? Or what about sensors combined with AI algorithms that can sense and improve food production, reduce the amount of food wasted, or run our data centers in our homes more efficiently? So microprocessors and silicon technology have enabled a seismic shift in the way humans interact with each other and with the planet. By creating more sustainable technology and by directing this technology at tools and tasks that can make our daily lives more sustainable, we can endeavor to create a more livable world and help our planet survive. So thank you.
That was great. Lots of other great topics I think we can engage on. I see some commonalities across these as well. So Shane, we'd love to hear from you.
Hello, thank you very much for having me today. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I'm showing you a map of the US and all of its data centers. Now, I study the commercialization of technology, and data centers in the United States today and around the world are the latest manifestation of a really rather extraordinary development in computing, which is bringing servers together into one location to achieve more efficiency and also achieve a level of computing and storage that was previously not obtainable, and therefore deliver services that were previously not deliverable. Now, look at this map. What do you see? Let me break it down for you. I know it's a lot to absorb. The green dots are private data centers, the hyperscale data centers that run by some of the largest firms in the world. The red, yellow, and sort of light green, there aren't very many of those, are the data centers that support private cloud or private corporate computing. Now, there's a couple things you should notice right away. First off, where do you find most of the private data centers in the United States? They're in the major urban areas, and they're located next to their clients. What else do you notice here? What don't you see? You don't see most of the data centers in North America locating in the Pacific Northwest, where, quite frankly, the costs are lower, where the electricity is cheaper, where the land is available, where the cooling requirements are lower. What you're observing here is a market that's telling the suppliers that they need to be close to their customers. And this has been the pattern in this industry now for quite a couple decades. And the hyperscale firms tried to experiment and are building hyperscale outside of major urban areas, but they're also facing this tension from their own customers that they have to locate architectures near them. So when you ask, what do we expect to see in the next 50 years? I expect to see actually a very strong tension between the location of supply and the lowest cost places to do it and the most efficient places to do it, and the needs of users to reduce the distance between them and their suppliers. And I expect suppliers will respond to that by having distributed architectures all over the country, in some sense replicating what we used to have with the private suppliers. Now, that raises a big societal question about who benefits and who doesn't from the deployment of this technology. And I'll just raise the question without answering it, just to keep the time short. There's a long-standing question about whether the 10 largest cities in the United States are the major beneficiaries of high tech, and that the rest of the country doesn't really benefit very much. Or whether the tech clusters, if you will, in the United States on the coasts are just the first users and everyone else gets to benefit soon enough and not long thereafter. And that tension will be with us for quite a few decades. And it's a central tension in our society today. So I'll raise the question with the picture, but won't answer it yet. Maybe we'll get back to it. How's that?
Goodness, there's so much to think about in all of these. Carol, I'd love to hear from you about
Sorry, Sarah,
the next 50 years. Go ahead.
So, Sarah, if I could interrupt, Shane, did you want to quickly introduce yourself, since I think this audience doesn't know your background? So do you want to kind of just talk a little bit about who you are?
I'm trained as an economist. I'm largely I study commercialization of technology, written books about the history of the internet and the commercialization of the internet and its transfer from its academic roots into into its commercial form. And today I'm a scholar of the digital transformation of business and the number of ways computing has been transforming business operations around the world. So that is my background.
Great. Thank you. Carol?
Oh, well, it's a great honor to be here and share with the audience about my thoughts on societal challenges. My name is Carol Jin Wu. So here's slides that I put together to sort of just give some numbers and guide the conversations. So how does your first smartphone tell when you enter this 15 amazing years of technology evolution? When I look back, digital technology has profound influence on societal well-beings of humans and really affect all things that touch upon our lives, from resource allocation to income distribution to economic growth. And as predicted by Gordon Moore, transistor scaling continued into the 2000s and digital technology continued to thrive in all forms. As what Partha and Bobby mentioned previously, as a community, we've seen innovations continue to into the 2020s, and with architectural optimizations to scale performance and energy efficiency over the past decades. And some of these innovations come through multi-cores, more efficient IC designs, specialized hardware, accelerators, thermal aware designs and management, right? Over the past decades, we see peak CPU energy efficiencies to improve 10 times over the decade. And with specialization, we see another 10x improvements in energy efficiency. As more and more computations is moving from cloud devices, client devices to the cloud, we see significant efficiency investments to happen at large hyperscaler data centers. So now between the traditional and highly optimized data centers, we see the power efficiency in terms of PUE has this stark difference. 40% higher efficiency for hyperscaler data centers, often located in rural America, as what Shen previously introduced. So while this efficiency of scales proliferates economic growth, it unfortunately exacerbates many challenging societal issues, such as it has enabled faster spread of disinformation, misinformation in online platforms, breaking election security, and it also allows bias from data to propagate into AI use cases at scale. And in addition, when looking forward, the global data center electricity consumption exceeds 200 terawatt hours. This is equivalent to the annual electricity consumption of Taiwan, Spain, Australia, or South Africa. It's a large amount. Furthermore, more than 700 million tons of carbon dioxide is produced by the information and communication technology. That's half of the aviation industry's footprint. However, only 50% of the world population is currently online, so we expect computing's carbon footprint to continue increasing. When examining sources of computing's environmental footprint, We found that the dominating source of digital technology's footprint to shift from operational energy consumption to exergy, the energy consumption required to manufacture system hardware. And as an example, for Apple devices, about 74% of carbon footprint comes from manufacturing of hardware, while the remaining 26% is from the use of electronics. So all growth exponential will have to stop at a certain point. If computing's environmental footprint is left unaddressed, we'll see economic slowdown, global warming to worsen, and the amount of e-waste to skyrocket, environmental and social injustice to accelerate. So going forward, I think the important question that this panel and our community should answer is, how do we build a future to scale technology growth more sustainably and to come up with innovative technology uses to improve our environment and to have positive societal impacts? Cool. So I guess for this very next part, we'll hear from Sarah, what she thinks about societal challenges that's faced by the community.
Great. So I lead responsible AI for our Azure Cognitive Services, which are a lot of our sort of core AI models at Microsoft, speech to text, computer vision, decision, language. And these are things that both people can build directly on top of, and external people use them, as well as we use them inside of our products at Microsoft. And when I started my career in systems, I didn't think I'd ever be thinking about topics like fairness and the societal impact of our technology. And so I think to talk about where we're going in the next 50 years, for me, that is a big part of the story. And I think a lot of the other speakers have touched on this as well, which is that we, for so long, I think, had great abstractions where we could kind of focus just on the technology and our point in the space, but we've been enormously successful. And so now the computing technology that we create has a giant impact on the world, positive and negative, which I think has been highlighted in many of the conversations before. And so the future is that we can't ignore this. And so we have to think about some of these bigger principles and our core values when we're creating technology. And fairness is one I mentioned, but also things like transparency and accountability, and how do we sort of make decisions when we're creating the core technology that can contribute to the creation of complete systems that have the impact that we hope they have on the world. So on my slide here, I have Microsoft's AI principles, just to emphasize this, that we suddenly have to think about these much bigger topics when we're designing technology. But I think that's also an opportunity, because a lot of these are challenging. They take a lot of expertise to think about how to apply them in our computing systems, in our AI systems. But that's also an opportunity for the way we are going, for example, with cloud computing, is that we can create tools and places where we've invested a lot of energy in thinking about how to make a model fair, for example, and enable many, many, many people to use that model and benefit from it. And so there's a lot of potential here for platforms and tools that figure out how to solve these problems and allow people to actually be able to benefit from that. So overall, I think we have a much different approach now when we're designing technology going forward, where we're actually going to need to really assess the potential positives and negatives of both how the technology behaves, how the technology is used, how we created it, how do we develop it responsibly, but also how do we ensure that it's used responsibly, and how do we ensure that it adapts to the changing state of the world. And so I think that the future is really going to be about marrying these much bigger topics with our technical decisions at every single layer. And it's not straightforward to do that yet, but I think there's a lot of things that we can do going forward. So with that, I'd love to actually get on to the rest of the panel discussion.
Cool. So Sarah, you highlighted that fairness as a key design challenges as we develop technologies. And I know that has been a major topic for discussion, especially for AI. Where are we today and what do we still need to do? Can you share some of your perspective more in depth with us?
Yeah, I think rightly so, fairness has been a very hot topic in AI for the last couple of years. And a few years ago, I think we were first at the phase where we didn't even know how to think about the problem, didn't know how to start making progress or test for it. Then there was a lot of work on algorithmic fairness and which metrics should we be using and how do we enforce this in model training. And I think I'm happy to say that it feels like we've come a long way since then, where now we actually have a much better understanding, for example, that there are different ways that AI systems can behave unfairly, whether we think of quality of service fairness, where it's the actual accuracy of the system, and is it equally accurate for two groups of people? And then we have allocation fairness, where we're thinking about the decision that the system is making. For example, if it were allocating loans, is it doing so unfairly between two groups? And then there's also how people are represented in the system, which is how the system actually, for example, talks about people or represents them. So a classic example here would be the search for CEO showing only men. But we're seeing this more and more in large language models, for example, where the way that we're talking about people in natural language, we need to think about the fairness of that and how people are represented. And then, of course, there's this larger question of fairness, which I think Shane brought up really well in his talk as well, which is the use of these systems and some of the bigger decisions we make, how does that impact communities unevenly? And so there's quite a lot. And so now with that, these different dimensions to think about, we are able to start breaking it down and figuring out how to make progress on these. And so quality of service fairness, for example, is a place where we actually really do understand how do we start testing for this, how do we mitigate issues, and a lot of the work is now really just scaling that and making the results in the lab really match what we're seeing in the real world. But for something like representational harms, we're still at the research phase where we are sort of struggling. We're seeing the issues and we can fix them in point places, but it's really foundational research to figure out how do we sort of make sustainable progress on this type of problem. And so I think there's a lot of interesting things to do here. Great. So then, Bobby, I know you do some work in inclusiveness and inclusion. Do you want to add anything to what we're saying here?
Yeah, I mean, most of the efforts I'm looking at or thinking about is how do we be more inclusive in terms of the technology that we develop and how it can be used in the world. So, for instance, some 90% of all accesses to the internet is through cell phones. It's not through other devices. And so, but we need to make sure that the technology that we build is compatible with that. So does it work on the cell phones? Does the information come down effectively, and is it representative? And the other piece is that a good portion of the population of this world does not live in countries that have steady power sources or steady internet, for that matter. So how do we develop technology when your power sources can be intermittent? Maybe our devices need to last longer. Our batteries need to be able to make sure the devices can last more than 24 hours because you might not have the power supply available to you. So, one of the things, I think the way I think about inclusiveness is that we need to be inclusive of capabilities, people's capabilities. Not everybody has the same physical capabilities. We need to be inclusive of their geography, where they're located, whether it be rural or in the cities. For instance, 40 million households in the US do not have broadband access. And then that, we can certainly talk about broadband access across the world too. And then we also need to be cognizant of people's economic capabilities. Not everybody can afford the latest and greatest thing, but how do we still provide access to those individuals who are working on older devices or cheaper devices. So that's kind of how I think about inclusivity in how we work with technology.
That's great. So another big topic I think we saw, Carol and Bobby and Bertha, all in your presentations was about environmental sustainability. And so I'd love to learn more where is this work right now and what do we still need to do?
Carol, do you want to take this or?
Sure. So I guess we've sort of talked about this earlier. Both we heard from Partha, Bobby, from the position statements about the ever-increasing carbon footprints. And so I want to sort of talk about specifically from AI's perspective. If we look at the carbon footprint of AI computing, that has really been increasing at a very unsustainable pace. And specifically, if we look at like paper publications, there are a ton. Strubel has a paper to talk about what is the footprint of training a state-of-the-art machine learning models, for example. So really like about a year ago, we wanted to really understand the environmental impact of digital technology and more specifically for AI training and inference, right? And while we were really glad to find out that the operational energy consumption required by computation has improved dramatically over the past decades, the energy required for system and hardware manufacturing hasn't been improved by much. What this means is that the dominating source of computing's carbon footprint is shifting from operational carbon emission to embedded carbon emission. And so the amount of carbon dioxide produced during manufacturing of the system itself and from constructions of data centers, for example, right? So this has a lot of implications on how we computer architects design the next generation systems, for example. First, if we were asking the question, like, how do we build a systems that consume only half of the carbon footprint from some of our prior conversation with Bobby and Partha, we immediately realized that it's quite challenging because we don't even have the tools to help us quantify the carbon cost of system components. And this is when I was really fascinated by Bobby's your keynote at Micro 2020, where you share with us a lot of insights and your knowledge in the space. And so I would really like to hear from you if you can share with us what industry is working on to help coming up with the metrics or to help standardize this accounting methods and the implications to the computer architecture community.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting that you mentioned metrics because I think that's the foundation for which we have to build any kind of sustainability standards. And unfortunately, the metrics are so fuzzy in this area. And depending on where something is manufactured versus it can have like a 2x or 3x difference in terms of its carbon emissions. So I think one of the pieces that we need to build in the architecture community is a solid foundation of the metrics and models that we're going to use to come up with placing this in the cost function that we use for evaluating everything that we do. Cost functions are power, performance, area, that really what goes into TCO. Now, if we're going to include carbon emissions or sustainability impact, we need to have a strong set of standards that are consistent across the industries, that are used by all our suppliers and also all the producers of data centers and devices and everything else. And so that we can actually come up with a standard that we can all agree upon and rely upon for consistency. I think Partha might have some other comments on this also.
Yeah, no, I think the interesting part again is this is a problem not just to the computing industry. This is a problem more broadly as well, right? I was talking to somebody who works in the EV cars industry, and to me it was actually surprising that some of the cars that are electric vehicles that you think is very energy efficient, but if you think about the overall holistic life cycle sustainability impact, including the embedded energy that Carol talked about, those are actually not the best for the earth. So and it's very non-intuitive, and that's exactly why we should be looking at that. And to Bobby's point, there's a lot of confusion and honestly bad marketing in this space. So and so you have to be really focus on that. Back when we worked on this area, we looked at exergy as a possible metric, and exergy is the embedded energy. It kind of unlike energy, you can talk about the disruption of exergy, and it's basically goes back to some fundamental thermodynamics, and that seemed like a good metric, but again, there's a lot of work to be done there as well. This is where again we have both academic work in terms of coming up with the various options and various trade-offs is very useful, but it's also important for industry consortiums. And I know Bobby has been working on some of the efforts, but I'm on the board of directors for Open Compute Foundation. And so this is one of the things we have a work stream where we have all the key hyperscalers all combining forces to say what is a good way to measure this. And it goes all the way to insidious effects in the supply chain as well. And Open Compute is looking for academic participation as well. So if any of you listening to this is interested in helping out in terms of enabling the research around this, both in terms of the metrology, but also tracking and think of the equivalent of MLPerf for sustainability, right? And so if we can have the spec in for sustainability, a good metric can do amazing stuff in moving the industry forward. So reach out to any one of us on the panel. Carol is involved, Bobby's involved, I'm involved, and there are a bunch of others from the community involved as well. So that's something to think about. I also want maybe we've been talking about sustainability at a very broad level. So I was going to pick the panel's brain in terms of looking at so sustainability ultimately boils down to a few things, right? So you have operational energy, and so the operational energy is the electricity that comes in and the electricity that is used. And obviously, the amount of energy used is something that this community, we all focus on. An accelerator that is customized for something is 10 times more energy efficient. And Carol, you mentioned the cost of AI in terms of the impact of all the workloads. But if you didn't use a TPU or a GPU, that would probably be 10 times even higher, right? So we do our part in terms of making it more efficient, and obviously we can do more. But I was also curious if the panel had thoughts on other aspects of the system. So, and in particular, energy storage, for example. If you think of the entire data center as a computer and start looking at optimizing that big computer, energy storage becomes very important with all the advances in battery technology and so on. There's a whole bunch of other stuff around water that we haven't talked about as well in terms of thinking about how we cool the data center. So I was curious if others on the panel had thoughts about more unconventional techniques that also start having implications on system architecture.
So I have a really cool example on how AI technology can help us out here, in the sense that, as what Partha alluded to, energy storage bring in an interesting dimension to this optimization space, right? With the batteries, all sort of energy storage that we have today. But really, like, these are gated by efficiency, like energy conversion efficiency. Most recently at FAIR, we had this cool project called Open Catalyst. So the idea here is that to look at, in order to sort of predict, to come up with a next generation renewable energy produced with like hydrogen. But in order to figure out the chemical reactions in hydrogen generated renewable energy, you sort of have to go through this huge predictive model. So this is where AI can help us to accelerate the discovery of chemical bonding to figure out new next generation renewable energy that we can pay attention to and potentially sort of embed that into the design space for sustainable computing.
That's pretty fun. I think I can see this work that you talk about fit into stuff that we do at Google, where we have carbon-aware scheduling, where we literally follow the sun and the wind, and being able to use AI in the way that you said would fit really well into that as well. So that sounds pretty exciting.
Yeah, I think one other thing with the whole power supply piece is the grid is not as stable as we imagine it to be. As ERCOT is once again, that's in Texas, by the way, is once again facing issues with really high temperatures, and now they might not be able to have enough power to supply for all the cooling required in the Texas area. So I think that what's going to happen in the future, especially with more disruptive climate events happening, is that we're going to see that this grid is going to be disrupted more often with more critical events. And so we need to, when we think about a data center, it is a huge sink on the grid. And so when these kinds of disruptive events occur, the data center needs to be able to be flexible in order to be able to accommodate for that, both for the sanctity of the data center, in order to make sure that we don't drop customers and people don't lose their resources, but also sanctity of the grid and the other consumers of the electricity on the grid. So we need to be aware of that and ensure that we can work with the availability of the resources that are there at the moment. And I have a feeling that that's going to become more precarious as we move forward.
Yeah, and I think that the point you mentioned, Bobby, is really powerful and worth double clicking on. And as we think about the next 50 years and how we as a community need to evolve to address some of the bigger societal challenges there, I think the meta point really is we can't be thinking about hardware and systems in isolation. We have to be thinking about the term that I sometimes use, and it's really software-defined hardware, right? Software-defined infrastructure. And the idea really is to think about hardware in the context of this flexibility, fungibility that you talk about. But then it raises some really interesting questions on what are the abstractions that you want to have, and what are the policies there, and what are the appropriate layers of software that you want to wrap around that? What is the SLOs that you want to have provided there? And how do you adapt here and say, hey, look, Epcot has this particular climate issue, and so therefore I'm going to change your expectation of what your service level objective is for this hardware to be able to move your workload to a different system or so on, right? And so this notion that hardware becomes a fungible unit in aid of solving a broader service level agreement that can adapt based on these events, I think is a very powerful one. And I think that's a big theme I personally expect to see in the next decade or so with computer architects having to push a lot more.
Yep, totally
agree. I want to build on top of what Parsa mentioned. I think there is this interesting balance between efficiency from accelerators versus general purposeness, because we also want to increase hardware lifetime as much as possible going forward, right? Cool. So in addition to all our conversations on this environmental sustainability piece, I guess for this next topic, Shane, you brought up another really great point that our decision on specific locations for data center can have a great impact on our society, groups of people. Can you tell us more on this particular point and what we should do about it?
Let me be brief. Thank you. It's in case you haven't noticed, today I'll just talk about the United States. The computing industry is regarded as one of the growing industries, one of the sources of the best paying jobs, one of the industries that support the new frontier in a lot of its using, in a lot of the industries that use computing and storage and data analytics. At the same time, we live in a society that, by historical norms, is at the greatest level of income inequality since the 1920s. So the greatest level of income inequality in almost a century. And that's a paradox that you have those two things existing at the same time. And when you look across the country, one of the causes, and certainly not the only cause, but one of the major causes of income inequality is the regional concentration of wealth in some locations and not others. And some of that can be linked pretty directly to the growth of high-tech markets and production in some locations and not others. And that's a big societal question that I think we will have to face going forward, and this industry will have to face going forward for quite a long time. And it's quite a charged topic. There are two views. One is that you tend to see what you might call an optimistic view of early use of technology in the tech hub centers. It eventually spreads to other locations. And then all you really need to do is have some patience. And that the experience with the smartphone somewhat is often brought up as an example that's consistent with that view, at least in the United States. The alternative is somewhat more pessimistic. There's privileged access, privileged availability, and limited use, typically in a small number of major cities. That's inequality, that it breeds resentment, and it means that many of society's issues are not dealt with everywhere with the same degree of technical sophistication. And in that case, if that's your view, then society has to intervene directly, and political actors have to intervene directly to overcome some of the drawbacks of what would not otherwise occur. And one of the examples I think you probably see that today most is in internet access, as has been brought up. The internet is probably the first major communication technology in 100 years that did not have direct government regulation determining its deployment in the United States. And the consequence of that was you have many low-density areas that have very limited availability. And there was an optimistic view that that would be dealt with satellite solutions and other wireless solutions. And by the way, you still hear some people say that. And there's also now a very loud pessimistic view that there is no solution short of government subsidy. So, and that's sort of a short window into a pretty charged conversation about technology and societal use that's going on today, and I think will be with us for quite some time.
Hey Shane, can I ask a follow-up question
Sure.
about that? So do you think that the way that COVID is potentially shaping how we work in the future, or has shaped how we work in the future, is that going to make a difference with respect to that, as people are no longer maybe clustered so much in the urban centers?
Oh boy, isn't that a great question? I wonder what you see across the world. I don't know how to think about that across the world. I'd be certainly very interested to hear your thoughts. In the United States, what we've observed, and now there's an open question of what will persist, what we observed was approximately 40% of the United States workforce was able to work from home during the pandemic. Disproportionately, it was those in the upper income occupations who had asynchronous work with within their organizations, except for, like, say, physicians who were frontline workers. And tended to also be the type of work that didn't require direct service to a user, didn't have to have face-to-face service. And the open question now is whether that's going to persist. I mean, there were certainly some drawbacks that have come with that. I think all of us are, know the loneliness that came with that, and as well as sort of more narrowly the lack of efficiencies that came from not having hallway conversations with your colleagues and so on. It also left a very distinct footprint on the downtowns of the United States. It shifted the use of data across geographic regions into some suburbs. It actually framed a bunch of big technical challenges for some of the carriers who had not made the investments in anticipation of this. And now an open question is whether some of the downtown areas, you think about downtown Chicago, downtown New York, downtown San Francisco, places of high density work. Do you really want to go? Think about it going forward. Do you really want to spend every day an hour traveling into that area and then another hour traveling out of that area? Or would you be happy to just do it 2 or 3 days a week? Would your firm be happy if you only did it 2 or 3 days a week? Even that kind of answer after this experience will have a major impact on real estate and will have a major impact on where we would locate our infrastructure to support work. So that's a very big question. I don't know that that's a 20-year question. That's really on top of us now. It's the next 5 years kind of question now. It used to be a long-term question, but COVID has brought it to the foreground. Certainly be happy to hear alternatives. It is a big question going forward, by the way. I agree with you.
I think talking kind of about the societal impact of decisions like location and where we choose to invest, we're also finding there's a lot of questions around the societal impact of like the use of a particular technology, right? Can it be used to reinforce historical power structures, as an example, where technology can work perfectly well and it can be fair, but the way it is used has a disparate impact on different groups of people. And I think that's been a very growing topic. And as someone who works on like the core sort of platform technology, it's been very hard to reason about. And I think originally as well, these can be used, in this way, or they can be used in that way. And it's really about the next layer that's building the system to think about. But I think we're seeing more and more as technology creators, push to understand what can we actually do to affect the use of the technology and the actual end outcome. And there's lots of cases where I think we don't know the answer to that, but the question is starting to be asked. And so I think even if you feel like you're very low in sort of the core computing stack, the more you understand these bigger issues, there actually are, I think, opportunities to influence the sort of overall impact of the technology on the world, including the use of it. And so I think that's a big sort of theme that we're seeing, and a lot of innovation is needed there.
Yeah, and I think a follow-on to that is also understanding how needs across different geographies change. So for example, we have an effort to look at Android for phones in India. And some of the use cases, some of the customer journeys around what the requirements are, whether it's the availability of internet connectivity or the kind of cultural mores there in terms of how people use phones. So I think that's the other aspect as well, is sometimes it's easy to design technology with a certain demographic in mind. And being open to changing those set of assumptions opens up a whole bunch of new opportunities for other cool work as well.
Agree. So as everyone's seen, we're sort of running over here, but I think we want to take a couple audience questions. There's been some great ones in the chat, and if you have any more, please do add them. Carol, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, so there is a question from sustainability. Should future conferences like ISCA allocate quota for in-person attendees from each continent and other attendings virtually with an objective function to minimize the total carbon footprint?
Good question. So when I was general chair of ISCA 2019, and one of the questions, or one of the data we compiled was basically kind of where people came from, so we can figure out the carbon footprint, right? And also, I think there was some discussion about potentially offsets. I think that's a great goal, but then that runs sometimes counter to the inclusiveness aspect, because ISCA does have a lot of population coming in from generally the North America region and potentially the European region, but we really need to think about being more inclusive of South America and Africa and all the other continents where we don't necessarily see as many people. So I think that, I don't know if it's quotas, but I think we should try to encourage as much inclusion as possible. I think, honestly, I think sometimes that's, especially for our community, maybe just as or more important than the sustainability aspects of the carbon footprint associated with people gathering.
So, but I think to me, the question is illustrative of some of the points we mentioned earlier in the panel, right? The complexity of understanding and measuring sustainability. And I think the way I look at this is you always have to be looking at this holistically. So there is a performance per exergy watts that you want to look at. And so just in the context of this question, you have to look across a multitude of options. Do we give carbon credits? Do we encourage more sustainable practices in how we think about the food that is served at ISCA, right? And to Bobby's point, if people from outside the country are writing more sustainability papers, is that make it worth their effort? It's the equivalent of performance per exergy watt here, right? So it's really a more nuanced question than just saying, hey, we want to focus on one aspect of the problem. But I think the spirit of the question really is, should ISCA be thinking about its carbon footprint? And I absolutely think yes. I see a lot of machine learning conferences, like Carol mentioned. Papers now have a footnote which says, hey, here is the sustainability impact of this work. And I think having a sustainability report at the end of each ISCA to at least measure the things that we can measure and starting to have this conversation about what could we do better is a great first step. So thanks for the question there.
Yeah, and I definitely feel that there's a lot of awareness that all of us can do and embed that into the research that we carry out. Thanks for sharing your thought. Sarah, do we have another question?
Yeah, there's a couple here. I think one of the questions was, as an architect and computer systems researcher, I often hear how hardware is used is out of our hands. How do we, what suggestions does the panel have for how we bridge gaps between the communities so students in researcher and architecture can play a larger role in addressing some of these societal challenges?
I guess I'll go first, since I'm going to probably take a slightly different thing. And maybe my more provocative answer is, I'm not sure I fully agree with the premise of the question. I think the validity is true that hardware is one piece of the broader stack, and so we want to be looking at, and sometimes it's a little hard to figure out exactly how we control the use of hardware and so on. But I do think that we have a pretty clear line of sight to the impact we make. And I think the example of how machine learning hardware has enabled a whole bunch of new advances, which in turn have done that, we can track these things, right? And there is several NAE, NSF, DARPA reports that have gone into detail on looking at tracking advances in computer architecture to fundamental advances in society. So I do think there is that connection that we can do. Now, I think the point the question is trying to make is we don't do a sufficient job of tracking that connection enough. Oftentimes, we are so fixated on looking at eking out some performance wins on spec-int that we don't really take that leap. And that's a fair point. And I think we should be encouraging more papers that focus on the end-to-end solution and the capabilities created by the solution, rather than just focusing on a limited benchmark that gives you that narrow view of not being able to think about stuff.
And I think I can add to this also that I think there are open questions, and that's, I think, the encouragement to understand some of the topics so that we can see where the opportunities are. But if I give an example in one of our machine learning systems, which can be used to analyze spaces and understand, for example, if people are struggling to social distance. This is a system where the goal is to understand the deficiencies in the space overall, but it's not about enforcing behavior of an individual. And so you can actually design in the system that you don't get individual information, right? You only get the aggregate information. And we can see this with like privacy technologies. And so there's certainly, I think, the potential to build things into systems at lower levels. How that translates all the way down to hardware, I think, depends a lot on the setting, and I think we have a lot to learn. But I think there certainly are opportunities that that could be explored.
I'll add one thing, and this is me as a managerial professor for a moment. We often teach as a fundamental principle, find a pain point for your user community and try to resolve it and try to solve it, try to address it. That should be your number one goal. What you often find in practice is that many firms solve the pain point for their friends and for themselves and their own social community, and they forget or don't pay attention to the pain points that many other users face who, they don't interact with socially. And so if I'm thinking about this societal issues for a designer, think a little bit about when you are solving problems and for whom you're solving the problem about a user that you may not see every day, and think pretty hard about what problem they need to have addressed rather than just the most direct one. Sort of an old truism in this area.
Yeah, that's a really good point that really resonates with me. I think now when we develop technologies, it's important to sort of take a step back and think about who the end user is and the impact of the product or technology or solutions that we put out there. And so like by doing so, like look at the bigger picture, it can help guide which research directions or directions of our work where we want to invest in time and efforts.
Great. So this was great. I think we're now solidly over time, so we probably should wrap it up. Does anyone have any last parting thoughts they want to share for the ISCA community in terms of what you really want to see people focus on? And I think with that, we can then wrap it up.
I think I'll end with, again, a theme that came up in the Q&A, right? So maybe 2 points. So one is we should be very understandably proud of the advances that we've had and the impact we've had in terms of the benefits we have created to society. And looking ahead, we should continue to be focused on the end-to-end solution, right? So the more we can understand the impact we have at the highest level of the stack, the easier it is for us to both motivate ourselves to continue doing more and to also understand the new challenges that we need to solve. So to me, if I had to end with 1 point, that's the point I would say is, as a community, the more we can up-level the impact of our work and understand how we do that, whether it's in our benchmarks, in our papers, in our methodology, in how we discuss our conferences, in how we describe our grand challenges, that would be fantastic. And then the 2 places it would boil down to is if we do nothing but continue to keep Moore's law alive and continue to do the phenomenal advances we've had, we are still doing a lot. And if we do that in a way that is clean in terms of sustainability, we get double benefits. So lots of opportunities still ahead.
Completely agree with that. Any other thoughts from anyone?
I just want to add one thing. I don't know if people here are old enough to remember the right-hand turn Intel made about focusing on power in the early 2000s. The perception was that if you built low-power things, that wasn't going to be high performance. Well, that actually was not the case. By focusing on power, we could actually end up building systems that are higher performing and more capable than they once were going to be. So I think the sustainability comes into the same bucket. It is a challenge, I think, but engineers really do their best work when they're under really tight constraints and challenges. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what we produce in the next few decades to address this problem, because I think it'll make the entire technology better overall.
Yeah, that's really a great point. I think I agree with both of those. My guidance would be, especially for the students, if the goal is to understand the bigger impact, look for opportunities to get out of your research community and collaborate with people who are at the other end of that story. I think it'll really change the way you think and your work. And I think there's amazing experts on all of these different types of topics. So I really take advantage of that. Carol, Shane, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'll definitely emphasize sound. Look at the big picture, look at things end to end, look at the end user that's using the technology that we are developing.
I'll just say thank you for letting me participate in this. I very much enjoyed listening to everyone. Don't need to reiterate anymore.
This was great. I personally also enjoyed it. So I think with that, we better wrap it up. But thank you all for bringing such important work and topics to the community.
Thanks for a great discussion.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.